Hey guys, Tony Corpin here with School Transportation News. You've made it to the webinar. We have 3 student-centric transportation strategies to reduce chronic absenteeism, and we got an all-star cast here of speakers to dive into the conversation today. Some familiar faces. We've got Greg Jackson. Greg, great to see you, my friend. And Greg is the new general manager of busing services at Everdriven. So, congrats on that, Greg.
Thanks, Tone. Good to see you also. Good to be seen.
Absolutely. We got Jim Ellis, another familiar face. Jim's the director of pupil transportation at Henrico County Public Schools. Jim, great to see you.
Great to be here.
And Courtney Pilata, the chief marketing officer, CMO extraordinaire of Everdriven. Thanks for joining.
Oh, so happy to be here. Thanks, Tony.
Yeah, absolutely. So this webinar is going to be talking about a great topic. I mean, absenteeism is definitely a big issue out there, and Everdriven has really kind of put together a very thoughtful conversation today to really help you guys address this bigger kind of, I'll call it elephant in the room, right? How do we deal with these big issues that kind of exist in transportation? So as we go through the webinar today, keep in mind, you can ask questions to our panel, throw it out. There's a questions tab. You just write your question in the box. It'll pop up. We'll address it. We've set aside some time at the end of the webinar to tackle that. Also, check our attachments tab. You can download the slide deck today from the webinar, so take advantage of that. And also keep in mind, this webinar is recorded for 24/7 viewing. So if there's someone else in your organization that would get value out of it, please definitely share it. It's at the same link on the STN website that you went to today. It goes up very quickly and can be shared out amongst your community, social media, any stakeholders in your organization. So it's really helpful to be able to kind of disseminate great information like this. So I'll throw it over to Courtney to kind of take us through all the exciting stuff you're going to talk about.
The topics.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Tony, thank you. We've done so much like fun stuff with STN the last 5 months. We did the Modern Student Transportation Awards. We were down at the event in Dallas. We're headed to STN East, where I think I saw that we had like some level of op-ed in. There's just a lot happening this time of year, and always appreciate STN's partnership and willingness to make sure we can communicate with folks who also think about student transportation all the time. I mean, I've been here for almost a year, but the amount of time I have spent now thinking about student transportation, or the reflections I deliver to my family about a bus versus a car versus a driver. I mean, there's a lot to be learned. Anyway, okay, so beyond that, we are talking about 3 modern student transportation strategies that we believe are winners. I think to just set the stage before we go into some of the questions, our intent today is to have a really open and candid dialogue. Greg and Jim have an incredible amount of experience across districts and their careers in a bunch of different functions. They think deeply and broadly about, I'll call it, what some of the gotchas are. How do you think about a modern student transportation strategy and then really stay ahead of the change, the last minute adjustments, the pressure on a budget when you think you already have plan A in place? We're going to try to uncover a lot of that today with some very candid feedback. We are also going to leave at least 10 minutes for questions at the conclusion. So go ahead and slip any questions that you have into the questions channel here. Tony's going to moderate us through Q&A. And we'll make sure all of that gets addressed. And the hope here is that everybody leaves with at least, we said 3 strats, but let's say you take one that is a fit for your district and team, and you can bring that back to what you start to think about as you start to think about next school year. We know it's budget season and getting ourselves to May and June and actively working towards what's going to be the next school year ahead. So with that, let's talk a little bit about attendance pressures. Let's talk about chronic absenteeism. Let's talk about ways we can mitigate that. I'm going to start with Greg, which is, in summary, Greg, what do you think about attendance today compared to 5 years ago? What's different?
5 years ago, attendance challenges were usually tied to events. A child was sick, a storm hits, or a family had a temporary disruption. The expectation that was once the event in the past, attendance returned to normal after those events were taken care of and things became stable. But today, the behaviors are different because routines themselves are less stable. Families are balancing work schedules and that may change weekly, childcare arrangements, housing transitions, multiple schools or service locations and programs all over. That means that the margin for disruption is very little. Transportation reliability now carries more weight because it anchors the morning routine. If the anchor shifts even slightly, families are often have no backup plan. A late pickup can mean a parent cannot wait, cannot leave their child unattended alone at home, or cannot risk being late for work, which we hear that all the time. That single decision becomes a repeated decision. Over time, attendance patterns are shaped not by large barriers, but by daily predictability. Transportation has moved from simply enabling, from simply an enabling process or access to actively stabilizing daily participation for the parent and for the student.
Yeah, it's really helpful. This idea that mobility, like it sounds like there maybe was a little bit more predictability, but now there are multiple factors that are driving change within what may be perceived a more static and predictable model in years past. To that end, Greg, what do you think superintendents and cabinet leaders are thinking or asking about transportation that they didn't ask 5 years ago? They didn't think they needed to ask.
Leaders are increasingly asking about consistency, student experience rather than efficiencies. That's where I think most times we always think that they want to know about efficiencies, but those are kind of the two topic areas. They want to understand whether certain student populations are more affected by service instabilities or how transportation influences attendance patterns. Transportation is now part of the equity conversation in school districts. Instead of asking how many routes we run on a daily basis, leaders are asking whether transportation reliability supports regular participation in schools. And what I mean by that is not just the school day and experience, but athletics and other programs that need support and need transportation. The focus has moved from operational output to a student impact.
So it's more human, it sounds like. It's not about the routes. It's not about the logistics. That part is assumed. Now it's about, is this the right, are we doing right by this kiddo? What are their needs? Are we ensuring that they're getting to school every day? And it sounds like the student is more the question than necessarily the operational part of the function. That's really interesting. Well, given that, I mean, it obviously presents a lot of pressure for a transportation team to now go far beyond the routes and the routing if those things sort of become assumed when they're not predictable or assumed. For Jim, how are transportation teams feeling, and where are they feeling the most pressure in this new current environment?
Well, I think that, regular school transportation to and from school, transportation is now being expected to be more flexible without more resources and money. When it comes to transportation in general, we set a run or a route and we kind of leave it. We make tweaks, throughout the year, taking kids off, things like that. But now we're asked to, respond to last minute changes and do it quickly. And they're asking us to be more supportive of these groups that need this immediate attention. But the things that also affect us are the ongoing driver shortages, how big of a budget or small of a budget you have, the locality, if you're in an urban area versus a rural area, what are your options, fixed bell times, things like that, where, our system was designed, to be consistent, but now we're serving an unstable group of students. And that's difficult for us to manage when we are based on setting the route and sticking with it, as opposed to, change it every day or every other day. And we just can't always match what we say we can do every day.
It's a really interesting point, Jim, that like in our world, the KPI, the job is to say, let's find predictability in these routes. Let's gain efficiency. Let's make sure all of that is working. And now I think what you're describing is at the same time, the ask is also make changes on demand to support these needs. And you're kind of going, which thing is the most important thing? Is the most important thing consistency and predictability and efficiency? Or is the most important thing making sure that all needs are met, even if mobility is driving a lot of change? So I can imagine that that's a pretty tough balance. Boy, sorry, I thought I was about to sneeze, but don't worry, I didn't sneeze. So, well, to wrap on this and make sure we get to the next one, let's conclude. These problem statements sound like both pervasive and very clear. But if you both were to think about what do districts sometimes underestimate about the connection between transportation and attendance, I think that'll give us a good foundation for our next topic. Who wants to go first?
I can go. I think that the biggest thing is reliability, and that's what's going to matter. Because if we miss one stop, that's going to create hesitation for the next day. And, where's my child? Are they going to make the bus, or they're not going to make the bus? And, transportation, it can be an emotional experience, especially for McKinney-Vento students, when those stops, if you're picking them up at a location, at a hotel or a transient place, that can be embarrassing. And sometimes it's going to be a long ride, and sometimes those long rides also can be overwhelming. So those are things that we have we kind of underestimate that transportation can actually do.
Yeah, do and really affect. And yeah, it's like a lot of detail in that, right? It really isn't just about the function. What would you say, Greg?
Well, districts often focus on large attendance initiatives, such as incentives and interventions, while overlooking the importance of daily reliability. Attendance is built on habit, and the habits rely on consistency. Families need confidence that school access will work every morning for them and their children, to make sure they can have a good way to start their day, especially for the students, start their day the right way and be prepared to learn. Transportation reliability influences confidence faster than most of the other factors. When reliability improves, attendance often follows without additional programs or additional needs.
So it's that predictability that can often drive the overall predictability, which is that if the right mode is there at the right time, that the end benefit is the right one, which is that attendance overall improves. Is good and certainly far more work than it seems to make happen. We know, but we'll talk about that. All right, cool. Well, then let's get into, so those were some of, like, in our world, the problem statements. What are the realities of those of you, of our speakers today, who are doing this job every day? And now let's talk a little bit about how do we make that better? How do we stay ahead of what we know this new normal is, which is operating really efficiently and also managing and putting students in the middle of supporting them no matter their needs. So we'll talk a little bit about viewing transportations through this attendance lens. And we're going to get into a couple of examples. So why don't we start with Greg? You've worked in multiple districts. It's fantastic because I learn from you every day. But let's think about an example where you've seen improving reliability change the attendance trajectory for a group of students.
Well, when districts clarify pickup windows and communicate consistent expectations, families regain confidence in the service because they now have a routine. And the students begin arriving more regularly, even though academic programs didn't change. The improvement came from predictability. Families can plan their mornings because they trust the transportation schedule. Prime example is I had a parent who, she had no faith in the transportation department when I was at Jeffco schools. Every year she would find something that we would battle about. And in those battles, part of it was always about consistency. It was synchronicity is what it came down to. We had to synchronize watches with her wall clock. She lived by her wall clock as the timing. So every day, so the first year I sat in the seat as the executive director, I had a driver who showed up. The driver had his watch. His watch was synchronized to the time of pickup, and he stayed for just 5 minutes. Parent never came out, and he departed. So for 2 days that happened, and mom wasn't happy about it. So she calls, and she, was very, very, let's say, very, very animated to how she felt about our service.
Get a lot of feedback.
And then again, this was my first year sitting in the seat, and this happens every year for 2 years prior. So I went out and met her where she was, and I went out to kind of do a kind of see what was going on. So first, I always kind of sit away and watch the interaction, see the time of the bus arrival, and I walk over to the actual stop. Mom comes out, she's walking out, and she's like, "You guys are early." So we're like, actually, I'm looking at, I got, Apple Watch on or some type of or your phone that's synced. She didn't have her clock on her wall synced to her phone. So it was something as simple as that. It was synchronizing watches or timepieces, but that did help her student to have now that bus arriving, help mom have more confidence in what we did. And then on top, the additional students on the bus was arriving on time and not delayed because they were, or it was a better process in the long term.
There's so much to be said for meeting someone where they're at. Because when you do it, you can drive a meaningful change because you've started at a baseline versus this push-pull. Well, to that end, on the flip side of things, like what is one assumption that districts sometimes make about transportation and attendance that doesn't always hold up in practice?
There's a belief that a shorter ride sometimes automatically means improved attendance. While comfort matters, but predictability matters more. Families adapt to a known schedule more easily to a variable one. Consistency builds routine, and routine builds attendance. And so that's something from this, years of doing this. Every parent I never had a parent who was upset about a bus that was on time or early. They were more about, or if we say we're going to deliver the student home at this time, or we're going to pick them up at a certain time, that was never the issue. It was always the issue about, again, you got delayed in traffic. Parent understands that. You had, whatever situation may have been, bus broke down, whatever. But again, it was always about that arrival time, that drop-off time. They're being dependable is what it came down to.
So being dependable and like probably setting expectations, like things happen, but how do we overall drive this really consistent experience? Super helpful. Jim, what about for you? When you look at attendance challenges, how do you determine whether transportation is part of the equation?
Well, for those students, my biggest determining factor that allows me to assess whether transportation is part of the issue, I ask, when students don't ride the bus, do they show up at school? If they make it to school, transportation might not be that integral in it, but when the students don't come to school because the bus didn't pick them up, I feel that we are part of the problem when we don't when we're not able to pick up the students. And when we do our best on our part because we track our students when they're riding the bus, as well as through a contracted transportation. We have a parent app, and that certainly helps when parents don't know when the bus is supposed to arrive, things like that. We give them those opportunities that this is when the bus is supposed to show up, and here you can, if you put this app on your phone, hopefully that you have that phone, you can follow the bus and when it's supposed to be there and when it's gonna and when your student needs to be outside. So we're giving them all the information, but just because we give you all that information doesn't mean that the bus is going to be on time. Depending on where you're at, traffic, all these things that can mess up a run daily sometimes happens for the wrong reasons, for the wrong students. And that's just the way it turns out that, we need to be on time, but something always out of our control, affects, what we do and how we get there and kills our consistency.
So would you say then, like on this other question, which is how does predictability influence attendance patterns? I think you've touched on it
Right.
for sure, right? Which is
Reliability matters.
Happen without reliability matters, and also but also things happen. Like the norm is that what is the phrase that the only normal thing is change, right? The only predictable thing in most people's existence is that change is pervasive. But would you say that when you think about the population of students experiencing housing instability and are protected by McKinney-Vento or foster care or medically fragile, that there is more importance relative to predictability, or equally predictability is equally important for all those populations?
I think that reliability matters for all of them. And I think especially the McKinney-Vento students, because they don't know where they're going to be tomorrow, and things like that. But, a lot of times when you're in foster care, you're hopefully in a stable environment that you've been placed in. And the medically fragile students, you're going to be at home, hopefully not moving locations as well. So I think that, they have a little more stability. So reliability, yes, it matters, but I think it's going to be more for the McKinney-Vento students because, we missed the stop. That's going to create hesitation. And is the bus going to come tomorrow? And this is the only means, that my kid is going to get there. And of course, if I can't, the student can't go to school, am I going to be able to make it to work? I mean, there's reasons why they're not in a stable environment, and it could be from a lost job or anything that, they don't know where their money's coming from, let alone where they're going to be tomorrow. So they've got to have some kind of stability in that.
Yeah, and that the downstream impact is really significant. This is a really good point, that the impact isn't just on the student not getting to school. It could be on the parent not getting to a job. It could be on the outcome not improving, that there's a lot on the line to have everything sort of go right. You guys deal with it all the time, but as in the world of a parent, the to or to not have a snow day in the state of Colorado. Every kid's like, yeah, give me a snow day. And parents are like, I have to go to work. And it's like a very simple and not as critical example, but the downstream impact is significant, which is why districts takes things like that incredibly seriously. All right, cool. Well, let's talk a little bit about strategy 2, which is the phrase that chance favors the prepared mind. Like, how do you prepare? How do you find yourself not surprised? And I think no matter your function, whether you're in transportation or marketing or sales or whatever the thing is, the more you can prepare and bring yourself into a process, the more likely it is that you can not have to adjust on the fly and you can make better decisions. But let's talk about, Greg, we'll go first to you on this, which is, in your experience, what actually prevents transportation from being included early enough in a process? And maybe like in answering that, will you give a little bit of background on what are the scenarios where transportation is included?
In my experience, transportation is usually not excluded intentionally. It's more often the result of longstanding work patterns. Many districts have developed processes where academic or student services decisions are discussed and finalized first, and then transportation is notified once the decision has already been made. Over time, that sequence becomes routine, even though it creates operational pressure later. Another common factor is perception. Transportation is sometimes viewed primarily as an implementation function rather than a strategic partner or contributor to the decision. The assumption is that once the educational decision is set, the logistics can simply be arranged around it. What often gets overlooked is transportation's feasibility can affect timelines, staffing capacities, cost implications, and overall student experience. At the executive level, what typically prevents early inclusion is not lack of commitment, but a lack of structural integration. If cabinet agendas and planning processes do not intentionally include transportation as part of the review to key decisions about their department, the involvement will naturally happen as I've described earlier. When leadership adjusts meeting flows and expectations, so transportation is a part of the conversation before final decisions are confirmed, the dynamic shift. Transportation can plan proactively instead of reactively. And that proactive planning directly supports smoother transitions more than consistent student attendance.
What do you think early enough really is?
Early enough.
Like, is there an early enough? I don't know. I'm the latest person on the planet, so not a question for me. But it was like, what is early enough in the context of? Let's just go frame. housing transition, or twice annual IEP reviews?
I'm thinking about IEP reviews. And it's like, to me, early enough is where you build a relationship with these other department leads, these ones that are, because I always tell people, you're an administrator. As a transportation director, manager, supervisor, whatever your role is, you are an administrator. So these other departments are your equals. So go have these conversations and build relationships, and kind of let these folks know that you are the subject matter expert for transportation. So decisions when you're sitting down at this table and they're making decisions about the needs for the student's disability, you don't have to be a part of all the real deep details of the medical needs, but you need to be there when they're making decisions or speaking towards your expertise, which is transportation. So if you build those relationships and you're starting with that early, then you have an opportunity where that individual is going to remember that, okay, we need to have transportation be a part of this, because maybe we need to put the student on into a car, put the student into a van, or put them into a yellow bus. You should be the person making that decision as transportation, not someone else who doesn't understand the true need of that student and what the capacity of the vehicles that you have to your disposal.
Really practical advice. I can see some questions coming through, so it's good. We'll address them.
That's always a question that motivates a lot of questions.
It's so true. The question brigade comes in. Someone has to ask the first question, like any of us in class or meeting, whatever it is. Jim, in your world, an example. We all love examples. Greg shared one on the prior topic. Can you share an example where earlier involvement in a specific student situation or case changed the outcome?
Yes. So there's so many times that we react to moves as they happen, which is usually going to cause an automatic delay in service. So if we know that something's coming, for instance, the student is here, but we know that they are moving to this location in 2 or 3 days, that timing certainly makes all the difference. Because now we're able to look ahead, see what buses are available, what openings we have, and potentially, we're going to solve that problem, and there's going to be a seamless handoff from, all right, we're not picking them up over here, but we're going to pick them up over there and drop them off there. And here's the bus information. We get all that out quickly, and everybody knows, the day of change, we're all on board, as opposed to receiving it today and it's got to be effective tomorrow. So by having extra time to be able to set up a service, we aren't causing a potential attendance problem, but we are preventing one from forming. So that's how I kind of see it.
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm going to ask a slightly different version of a question on this one. I'm thinking about how you have to consider all appropriate modes for the student, similar to the topic you guys brought up at the beginning of the call. When you have more time, does it change the way you think about what mode is right for that kiddo? I guess I'm thinking it struck a tone with me when you're saying, like, if you have 72 hours to make a decision, can you think about it differently than if you have 24 hours?
Right. Generally, our normal process, it's usually between 3 to 5 days we can get you something. But if we've got 3 to 5 days in advance, well, that's going to certainly help us get that student with the needs that they need. But when we are doing it as quick as possible, there's always going to be some possible pickup confusion. Where is the student standing? If they're at a hotel or at a place that they may have 2 entrances, and you're at one entrance and we're at another, that's going to cause some confusion. But when we don't have, some leeway in being able to make a change, sometimes absences are going to be immediate because we know that we're not going to get it tomorrow. And there's going to be a delay.
Yeah. I mean, at Everdriven, we see this same thing, right? Which is we're trying to move. When we like to have more notice on a change to make sure we put the right driver on the right trip. At the same time, some of those situations are like, if that takes 5 days, that kiddo's not going to school. So even, irrespective of what an SLA might be, the reality is a very human reality, which is the faster you can move in a lot of these situations is the difference between attendance or non-attendance. And it certainly, drives a bias to action for sure. All right, well, I'm going to move us to strategy 3. And let's talk a little bit about, to make sure we have, kind of give ourselves a little bit of time for questions. Let's go to what it means to strengthen governance and cross-team communication. So we've talked about a couple of things. We've talked about the challenges around driving attendance. We've talked about how to become part of a process earlier. And if you think about that as a bit of an evolution, then what can you actually do cross-functionally to make a reality out of how do we work across teams to actually do these things that we know are really important? So we'll go to Greg first on this, which is, once transportation is involved, so let's just say all the things have gone right, you've been brought in early, it's an IEP review, someone on your team is sitting in the session because transportation is going to be a part of the conversation for 15 minutes and you're there. Where do communication breakdowns most often occur across departments? So transportation's in it, but you still see some breakdowns.
So most communication breakdowns don't happen because teams are unwilling to share information. They happen because each department operates on a different timeline. Student services may finalize a placement once they know what is best for the student. The school prepares for enrollment based on that decision. Transportation is often informed only after the effective date is already approaching. At that point, everyone is trying to do the right thing, but the timing forces reactive work. Another common breakdown happens in translation rather than notification. A change is communicated, but not with the operational details transportation need to act. For example, a message may say a student will start Monday without clarifying dismissal time, supervision needs, or whether the schedule alternates. The result is followed with questions, delays, and uncertainties for the family. What makes this challenging is that each team believes they are communicating clearly. The issue is not the communication effort, it is communication structure. And when information flows are predictable and occurs early enough, the same teams operate smoothly together.
Yeah, there's so much in this life where the challenge is in the detail, which is like, oh, Greg's like, I told you, Courtney, it was Tuesday at 2. And you're like, Tuesday at 2 for who? Tuesday at 2 to where? Like there's so much, and that obviously is a very, very simple example. But the importance of getting it right to make sure any accommodation is offered that is really important is just taking the time to ensure the communication is one that can be acted on. Let's talk about what strong cross-team alignment looks like. At a cabinet or leadership level, I'm sure you've seen this in places you've worked. Like, what does good look like?
Strong cross-team alignment at cabinet level starts with shared ownership of student access as a leadership priority. That means transportation is not viewed as an operational afterthought, but as a strategic partner in the decision related to placement, programming, housing transitions, scheduling, and so on. At the executive level, alignment looks like clarity around decision flow. Cabinet members understand that when a student level or programmatic decisions is being considered, transportation impact is part of the decision before the decision is finalized. Student services understand the operational information transportation needs in advance. Transportation leadership understands the educational priorities driving the decision. Communication expectations are agreed upon at the leadership table, not left for departments to sort out later on. In aligned executive teams, decisions feel measured rather than urgent. There are few last-minute escalations to the superintendent because timelines were coordinated earlier. Leaders spend less time resolving operational friction and more time focusing on student outcomes. And the family experience more consistency because the messaging from schools, student services, and transportation reflects one unified plan. At best, strong alignment at the cabinet level creates a predictable rhythm for how decisions are made and implemented. The rhythm stabilizes daily operations and directs support consistent student attendance.
Measured versus urgent. It is so true. Most people tend to appreciate measured, and urgent doesn't lend itself to making sure every detail is accounted for.
Your urgency is not their urgency.
That's right. Right. How often is that met with like, yeah, you and 15 other requests, like have a good one. All right, Jim, what about expectation setting? You know, we talk a lot about accountability in life, you know, kind of like who is responsible for what. Are we going to do the things we say we're going to do? How do districts really create shared expectations across teams where goals are different across transportation, special education, and student services? Is that led by transportation team? Is that cross-functionally determined? How do districts do that?
Well, I think piggyback on what Greg was saying, that everybody's technically siloed in their own little areas where student services, they want the access, the stability, and the students there. If you're dealing with your special needs students, they want making sure that there's compliance and we're following the IEPs. And while transportation, we're just working to make sure that we have safe and reliable service. And if we don't get together and clearly define who's going to manage what, we always going to be chasing our tail on getting it straight. So, we have to determine, who's going to notify transportation when a student status changes. Whether it's, special needs or student services, we have one person that's going to give us the information. We don't have several people that give us that information. And who's going to determine get the details back to the families? Well, we'll get it together and we're going to give it right back to them to make sure that they do the contacts. And, once the service begins, who's monitoring that attendance? Well, we're monitoring that attendance to make sure that we are successful in getting these students to and from school and they are using the service. I think one of the biggest things that we hate in transportation is took an individual 2 hours to get this set up and then they don't use it. So we want to make sure that we're setting it up, which is, what we want to do. If you want a ride, we're going to give you a ride. So let's use it. And then of course, who's going to intervene if something happens? And if we can get together on exactly who's going to manage what, I think that's our first foot forward. Because like you also said, our timelines don't align usually. So we've got to, get together and determine exactly who's doing what and where we all fit in the process.
So how does that impact structural changes? Because it sounds like those are fantastic opportunities for folks to figure out who is responsible. Does it result in having to make structural changes to any sort of team or function? I guess I'm thinking of it in the context of, I'll use an Ever-Driven example. We work very closely with MKV liaisons, and we work very closely with transportation directors. In some districts, MKV liaisons procure transportation. In some districts, MKV liaisons partner with TD leads and manage transportation. So is there some sort of like structural consideration that you would call would set a team up for success?
Well, I know that for us, when we certainly use contracted transportation, depending on if it's a McKinney-Vento student, their first ask is, can we fit them in? If we can't fit them in, our McKinney-Vento people, they reach out for that contracted transportation. And if we can fit them in, that's great. But as far as our special needs, individuals, we look at how long it's going to take for us to get them set up. And if it's, within days, we're gonna be able to do that. But I think that everybody's got to know, for us, my SPED routing team, they're the ones that are going to reach out to the contracted services to do that. So there's two groups that call, for our contracted services, and those two manage between each other, how we address it and what's going on. So that I can't say that there's a change, but we certainly know who is going to do what and how it's all managed.
Yeah. So to your earlier point, which is it's well understood who does what, how it happens can be variable, which is, I think you explained, can be in a reality. There's a plan A, which is if we have room, we're going to figure transportation out for this kiddo right now. And if the answer is that's going to take a minute, there's a plan B. It is always nice to think about the fact that in those scenarios, the student continues to be at the center, which is what is the absolute best path to ensure this child or children can make it to school. Well, really helpful. Let's so we came up with 3 strategies, folks, and I'll flash them back here, which are simple. Let's think about transportation as a driver for attendance. That ties itself to budgets. That ties itself to better outcomes. It ties itself to higher graduation rates, like really meaningful outcomes for an entire district that always starts with, can we get those kiddos to school? Strategy 2, which is involving transportation earlier in student level decisions. When you put the student at the center of the model and they're the hub, the spokes are everybody who's responsible for making sure that outcome is great. And transportation oftentimes is a group that needs to be part of those conversations, not always, but often. And then finally, how do we strengthen governance and cross-team communication? And the number of times that things get lost in translation, like just regular, oh, I thought so-and-so was doing this. I thought my responsibility was X. You just often cannot be clear enough about who's doing what, especially in busy teams where volatility and change are the norm. But let's go to a conclusion on this, which is like, we talked about the strategies. Folks here are probably thinking, what would I do tomorrow? What is the first thing I should think about? How can I take at least one of these elements that I've dedicated 41 minutes of my time to today and a little more, and say, Greg, I'll go to you first. How do we take this to action? What is a common misstep that districts make when trying to act on these ideas too quickly? Do you start small or do you start big?
A common misstep is attempting to solve coordination challenges by launching a large initiative or purchasing a new system. Those efforts can be helpful, but they often delay progress because staff must learn new processes while still managing their daily responsibilities. Lasting improvement usually comes from constant habits rather than major redesigns. When teams focus on small, predictable actions such as regular communication, clear timelines, they reduce the number of urgent situations. Over time, those small habits become outcomes more effective than large, sudden changes.
Yeah, it's a good everyday practice lesson, but it is so true. How many times do people like, if you can only do these 3 things, you're like, how about I'm going to start this one thing? Every day, I'm going to reach out to the special education team and confirm there are no changes. I've made this up, but it is something. I would say for you, Jim, how can leaders apply these strategies without overhauling their whole system? Similarly, like how can you do that? How would you do it?
I think one of the biggest things that you got to start off with is being able to assess what resources you have at hand. And of course, every district is going to be different. You're going to have the large districts, the small districts with money, districts without money. And if you have the resources at hand, there's a lot of things that can be accomplished. But when you're lacking the money, and of course all of these initiatives that we are asked to do, nobody gives us extra money to transportation to be able to get this done. So we have to work on our budget and everybody else's budget to see if we're able to what we're able to achieve, and everybody's got to be aware of what we can offer and what the resources are at hand when you're making these decisions with the IEP changes, as well as where these students are and how we're going to get them to school. If it's based on I get an IEP that a kid is going to the specialty center that's 2 hours away and 2 counties away. The first thing they don't ask is, do you have the money to do it? It's just, it needs to get done within the next week. And they never have the money to give us, for those resources, but we certainly have to make do with what we've got. But again, if everybody's aware of the resources that you got at hand and what you can and can't do, and where you're lacking and what you can do to overcome those deficiencies, I believe that's the big part of it.
Yeah, is it really, really helpful example. Now, last question, and we'll go to final thoughts. If Jim, you were we can say if it's a district is here today and they're brand new in their job, they're like working on a 90-day plan, or you're brand new into a new role and you're working on we'll call it like a 6-month plan, since school year works in very well-defined ways. What's one small step you'd take in the first 30 days to get started?
I think the biggest first step that you got to manage is to define who is doing what and how the process is going to be executed. If you've got the IEP team going one direction, the McKinney-Vento team going in another direction, and of course transportation on our own track, we've all got to come together and be able to define exactly what we need to accomplish and how we can each work with each other to determine the best outcome.
Very logical. Definitely makes a lot of sense. All right, well, let's go. Last statement. We're going to call these like closing words, right? Like, what's the last thing we can leave with? And then we have a bunch of questions that we want to get to. So I'll go with just one final for both Greg and Jim. You guys have shared both really meaningful insight and a lot of prescriptive advice relative to how you might tackle challenges like this, looking at next school year based on your experience. And we'll go, Greg, to you first, is just from a broader view that you've had across districts in your time, both on the district side and on we'll call it on the non-district side of things. What's a pattern that stands out, and where do you see leaders gaining traction?
One of the most consistent patterns is that improvement is not driven primarily by resources, technology, or district size. It's driven by alignment. Districts make the progress trend tend to treat transportation as part of the student support system rather than a downstream operational step. When transportation is included during planning conversations, the entire system becomes calmer and more predictable. In those districts, routing decisions are no longer rushed responses to finalize plans. Instead, transportation staff understands the intent behind student placement. Schools understands operational realities. Families receive clear expectations. The result is fewer last-minute adjustments and fewer situations where a student misses school simply because of logistics were unresolved. Another pattern is that timing matters more than complexity. Districts can often assume they need new tools or major reconstructing, but the largest gains usually come from simply coordination habits such as early notifications, shared documentation, consistent communication. These patterns create stable daily routines and stable routines directly to support attendance. So when students know what to expect each morning, families trust the plan, and it will work in the long term. Participation becomes much easier for a parent to want to use transportation, whichever form it comes in. Attendance improved not because of a single initiative, but because the system feels reliable. Small coordination changes, therefore, have a very real impact on students and families. It helps to reduce stress, increase confidence, and allow students to focus on learning instead of on logistics. I know that was a mouthful. Sorry about that.
No, I thought it was good. I'm listening here and I'm going like, there's a lot to
like Tony. I'm trying to sound like Tony with that flow.
Flow. I like it.
Don't worry, Greg. Don't worry, buddy. We got lots of good questions, though. They keep chumming in. You guys, if you want to ask questions, go down to that question box, drop one in. I can tackle a few of these, but I want to take Courtney's thunder. You got any other closing thoughts, Courtney? You want to kick to Jim and Greg before we dive into these questions?
Only last one, which was Jim. Is there anything you want to leave with? Which was it from your seat, leading a busy transportation district in an urban area in Henrico? What's the most important shift you think leaders should be thinking about when they think about attendance?
I think that the most important shift that we have to be looking at is that we're moving from seeing transportation as a scheduled service to kind of understanding that we're now being seen as a stability function that directly influences attendance. By our expectation is no longer defined by having an efficient route and timeliness. We've got to be now more responsive and predictable and trustworthy for the families that we are serving. Families don't need perfect transportation, but they certainly want transportation that they can count on.
That is a perfect closing statement. No truer words. All right, cool. Tony, let's flip it over to you. We got a lot of questions, and we're gonna do our best to get through them.
Yeah, no, I feel you on that, Jim. As a parent of a child in elementary school, I am guilted as a parent. If my child is not at school, the office calls and they're like, hey, like, we're going to miss out on reimbursement if your child does not show up. So for those that have kids, like, this is the real deal, right? It affects the bottom line. It affects the budget and the revenue. So I think probably one of the questions that I just saw come in, which is very interesting, specifically because this webinar is so around absenteeism. Probably more for you, Jim. How do you identify which student groups are most vulnerable to transportation-related absenteeism? How do you look at that?
Again, I think that the most vulnerable ones are going to be the McKinney-Vento students, because there's just so much uncertainty that they have of, I don't know where I'm going to be tomorrow, or is the bus going to come? Am I going to be able to see my friends? Transportation does so much more than getting somebody to school back and forth. It's a matter of their liveliness a lot of times.
Courtney, do you see the same thing? I know, does EverDriven track anomalies like that, where you can see kind of like, hey, there's a variance here in a specific district, or you're starting to see like, hey, consistently certain districts perform one way, but we're seeing anomalies in other places, and the causality of that. Do you see that as kind of a...
We do see it, and it is our commitment to our clients and the districts that we serve to continue to provide insight on that same thing, which is we know, because we learn from Jim, from Greg, who's here, that this is a legitimate metric that transportation teams are tracking. So if all of a sudden student A, we were running a trip for 100 days and we haven't seen them for 3 weeks, we know to ask, like, what happened with that kiddo? Is there something else we can do? Sometimes we see just absolute fantastic partnerships from districts who are telling us, like, you know what, a student moved out of district, this is what's happening. But we'd absolutely have the back end capability to do that. And our commitment is to say, how do we get even better at proactively notifying our district partners about changes that they might see, but they may not.
Interesting. Another question came in, an interesting one about policy. So is there kind of a policy you look at, Jim, where an adjustment could be made to make an immediate impact on reducing absenteeism?
We don't really have a policy, but it's lately, that's one of the things that's not really on my radar until it is, until it's a problem, and then it's on me to make an adjustment to see what we can do to get that done. But again, we're working with ebb and flows. It's as they come and they go. It's we do our best to roll with the punches and just stay up. And I think that that's one of our biggest things that we certainly work towards is just making sure that we are able to make the adjustments and everybody's in communication with each other so that we're able to get those students to school, because it becoming an issue with students and absenteeism and all these things. It's like, at one point, well, absenteeism, if they get on the bus, I'm there. But it's not a matter, well, if the bus doesn't show up, then I'm not doing my job to get them there. So that's where we're at.
Greg, do you typically advise EverDriven clients of any policies in particular that the audience might take advantage of that you could share?
Currently, I haven't any of the EverDriven clients, but I've been working with a lot of folks internally here at the company and walking through certain policies of what's out there and how the best ways to operate. And again, it's just, again, right now, I could, with Courtney and myself and many other people here, is having the folks here understand more about the understanding of yellow bus and when it comes to, all transportation, there's similarities, but there's also many differences. But the similarities is that we still have to focus on that student and how we get that student from A to B. So, from a policy shift, I always look at it from a standpoint where, from what I've seen over the last couple of years, working with districts across the country, one little shift that someone does in a way of being able to help towards a better experience for a student has always been the success for that district or that department. And most of the times it came from a standpoint of just making one little tweak of, hey, I need to have this conversation with you early, like we were saying before, about we have a student coming your way. This student has certain needs, and that student needs help and support. And when that happens, it then opens up to internally from a district standpoint, especially if you have someone who's a go-getter, in transportation. It's just like, hey, we got to make changes here in the way we communicate. Then you get it to the cabinet level. You get it to, then you start looking at policy changes. You start looking at ways that you're going to govern and function better. Because if you're not having those conversations and you're staying, like Jim said earlier, in your little silos, because that's what happens in most cases, then that's when we're failing the student, because we're not giving the student their needs and support they need. So the more that we start to get out of our silos and get out of our comfort zones and start speaking to everyone and looking at everybody as equals, that's the thing. We're all administrators, right? We're all here to educate, and we do education by giving the student a pathway to get to school. And so that's our job as an educator. We have I call our school bus drivers. School bus drivers, they're educational transporters is what they are, because they start that day with that student. They make that student's day either by, that greeting, and then they get them to school, have a meal, and then they go in to learn, and then they get them home safely. So it all functions from that internal conversation from the beginning of when we're placing that student on a bus, what process of information do we have, and how is that information going to process that we go from A to B to C to D to get that student to A to B and back from
Nice.
B to C.
Yeah. Jim, I think this one's for you. We need your sage wisdom on this one. Probably a very common question. My budget's tightening. How do you recommend I protect student transportation services? What do you think of that one? Obviously it varies based on the size of the district, the dynamics, but what do you see in your career as effective strategies to kind of protect student transportation from budget crisis?
Well, one of the things that someone just told me, a little birdie from one of my assistant superintendents, is, hey, we're looking to cut 3% across the board. I said, well, what am I supposed to cut?
Typical story.
Do you want me to not pick up students? Because what am I going to cut? The fuel budget, the repair budget, drivers? Where am I going to make a cut? It's going to be difficult to determine, what we are going to look at and what we're going to be able to do, because I don't see how I can cut stuff, but they're going to ask me to do that. And we're going to have a serious, conversation, because we've just gotten to a point where I have enough drivers. Hey, that's great. But now you're asking me to cut what I've got while we're in this good place. What are you going to do? So unfortunately, that's going to be a new thing to me that I've got to address. So unfortunately, I can't say what I'm going to do, but I know that I've got questions on exactly where you want me to make a cut.
You want to contextualize what 3% means? Like, what is that actually in dollars? Because it sounds like 3%, but we're talking like $1 million. What are we talking?
So my budget of $45 million. That's a nice little chunk somewhere. And I don't know, what that means, because at one point when we were 140 drivers down, there was some extra money there because we weren't employing a lot of people. But now I'm fully staffed. So now what am I going to do? What am I going to cut? So that's that 3% is probably a lot of people, smaller school districts. That's their entire budget. And, when you're dealing with 600 plus buses and, transporting 40,000 students, it's going to vary and it's going to hurt a lot different depending on your size and the budget that you're given.
Yeah, and just like quick napkin math, that's $1.35 million. So that's not exactly like a small slice of the pie. Just to put that in context for the audience. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a common story, Jim. I mean, and again, we're kind of out of time, but a very common thought there on tightening budgets and leveraging your partners, your friends at EverDriven, obviously giving you tools and strategies to address absenteeism, to try to get kids there, to get those reimbursements, proving value. Definitely really great having a partner that is able to work hand in hand with you to address those concerns and tackle those needs for the community, the kids, the school, all those sorts of things. Any just closing thought, Courtney, before we tie off here?
Well, one, because we're right at the time. STN and Tony, thank you. Okay, we love the platform. Jim and Greg, like invaluable insights, so much perspective here that we were talking about in our prep yesterday. You guys kind of like, you just have this in your heads because you live it every day, and everybody's at a different phase of their journey. So being able to share a couple of pragmatic steps transportation leaders can take as they start to think about the conclusion of this year and next. Awesome. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing whoever's going to be at STN East next month. And thanks again. Great session today, guys. Have a wonderful Thursday afternoon on a short week.
Yeah, well, we appreciate EverDriven and we appreciate our panel here for providing us great insights. Again, reminder, guys, this webinar is available for 24/7 viewing at stnonline.com under webinars. If you go to our news section, you can find it. Please share it within your organization. Find out more about what EverDriven does, the tools they're providing clients to enhance transportation and address absenteeism. And, again, don't be afraid to find them at STN Expo East in Charlotte. That's March 26th to the 31st out in Concord. So that's coming up T-minus like 5-6 weeks. So great chance to get in front. Everybody's going to be there. I'm sure we'll find a place for Jim to talk because he's a fountain of knowledge over there. And we appreciate everybody being on, and thank you so much, and enjoy your week.
Have a good one. Thanks, guys. Bye.